You may be familiar with a lady called Ash Sarkar. She is a senior editor at a small communist media company called Novara Media, but Ash Sarkar herself is most famous for telling Piers Morgan that she is a literal communist.
Basic facts about your hero Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm a communist, you idiot.
She regularly gets to appear on television and has various media appearances and writes columns in various newspapers, including one that I recently discovered that she had written in 2018 from The Guardian. And it's about a woman called Pritilata Waddedar. Sorry, I'm butchering pronunciation. But this lady, Miss Waddedar, has a Wikipedia bio, and we can have a look as to what she is notable for and why someone might praise her. So it turns out that she was a Bengali nationalist who came from a middle-class family who, in the early 1930s, when she was about 18 years old, had joined a revolutionary group that didn't normally allow women to join, but it was reasoned that in the fight against the British, the women might be able to smuggle weapons and other equipment without suspicion. And Waddedar herself took part in many raids against British infrastructure, such as telephone and telegraph offices, when on the 24th of September 1932, she led 15 revolutionaries in a terrorist attack on the Pritilata European Club. The significant detail that is repeated, that seems to be the motive to justify it, is that the club was ethnically exclusive. The club itself was a racist club. It had a sign on it that said, "No dogs or Indians allowed," which is very racist. In the attack, one woman died and 11 people were injured as they threw various munitions at the club, and the club was set on fire. Waddedar herself was actually winged by a revolver shot during the encounter, but escaped, and then, to evade capture, took some cyanide that the revolutionaries had been given prior to the attack and died from that. She was lionized as a Bangladeshi freedom fighter. She's portrayed in movies, memorialized in statues, and even described by one person as an ideal for every woman, which is pretty high praise for a terrorist. But then we come to Ash Sarkar's 2018 article, and I found this very, very interesting. I love the way this is phrased. This is worth thinking about in the context of Ash Sarkar's revolutionary communist politics. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, a communist position and a nationalist position would usually be held to be mutually exclusive. Communists are not nationalists, nationalists are not communists, and never the twain shall meet. But she says, "My great-great-aunt was a terrorist. Women's politics went beyond the vote." It's not good to go beyond the vote. That's why they're called terrorists. That's why we denounce terrorists. The use of force in politics is anti-democratic. And the vote is something that we'll talk about in a minute. But she begins with, "My great-great-aunt was a terrorist." I'm not talking about the sense in which the pacifist Mahatma Gandhi was branded a terrorist by the British Parliament in 1932. Pritilata Waddedar was an active participant in armed struggle against the British state. She supplied explosives, she fired a gun, and I'm proud of it. It's very interesting. So we're proud of an ethno-nationalist terrorist for her struggle against the imperial occupation of her country by the United Kingdom. She gives us a short history of women's suffrage both in Britain and across the empire, which includes Indian women voting in provincial elections, although at the time they couldn't vote in national elections, before introducing us to her great-aunt's contribution. She says, "Bengal in the 1930s was a hotbed of anti-British revolutionary activity, and women were at the heart of this insurrectionist movement. Shanti Ghosh and Suniti Chowdhury and various others helped the Jangantar Party carry out a string of bombings against the occupying British, and my great-great-aunt Pritilata Waddedar packed in her job as a school teacher and took up the gun." Now, it is true that it was the British India at the time, but to frame it as British occupation makes it sound in the same sort of way as the Nazi occupation of France, something that had only just happened and was obviously prone to a swift reversal. The British were actually occupying India for the better part of 400 years, and many of the people that were attacked by Pritilata Waddedar were probably born and raised in India. So it's not quite as clear-cut as it might seem to sound from what she's saying here. And this kind of mythologizing of what's happened here, she packed in her job as a school teacher and took up the gun as a heroic ethno-nationalist freedom fighter. It's a persistent theme in Ash's writing on the subject, here and elsewhere. But then Ash Sarkar herself is a bit of a revolutionary ethnocentrist anyway, as you can probably see from some of her previous social media posts, where she seems to take pride in the changing demographics of Britain, which is a strange thing to think about, but it seems to be something that she thinks about. She says, for Pritilata Waddedar and the other female participants in the freedom struggle, armed anti-colonial insurrection was the only means by which women could achieve their liberation. It's not true though, is it? That's mythologizing, because that's actually not how Indian women achieved liberation, by which I think she means the vote. As Ash tells us in the article, not only was the national vote gained after independence, so this act of terrorism didn't gain them the national vote. This was won through Gandhi's passive resistance anyway, so terrorism wasn't even this contributing factor, by her own argument. But she says the suffragettes in Britain argued for their political selfhood by supporting their menfolk in warfare. In the colonies, women joined them on the front lines. Certain kind of air of ethnic superiority there, isn't there? The white women of Britain merely supported their men from behind the front lines, but no, the non-white women of the colonies, they went to war on the front lines, and therefore she's kind of assumed the British standards that modern liberal democracies are a good thing, and suggested that actually they've been superseded in this way. And I think it comes really from the fact that this is a family story. She says, I learned the family story from my mum, who was an anti-racist and trade union activist. This, just to interject, is essentially a code for communist. And Ash Sarkar has otherwise bragged that her mum met Mao Zedong at one point. So you can see the kind of circles she must have been travelling in for that to be the case. Ash Sarkar, again, herself is just a revolutionary communist. Her mum seems to have been. It seems to be something that runs in her family. She says she heard it from her mother, who had herself been a fierce advocate of Bangladeshi independence. Across 2 continents and 4 generations, a tradition of sedition, agitation, and absolute sheer bloody-mindedness ties the women of my family together. Strange, isn't it? Like a tradition of sedition, agitation, and bloody-mindedness. I mean, normally it's love and family bonds and the care for one another that is what ties families together, not traditions of sedition that, again, didn't even get the desired effect, and someone else had to liberate women. But I don't think this is something that is something we should be lauding, especially not in the 21st century, nearly 100 years after the events that are being recounted. That I don't think they have any kind of position of... they shouldn't have a position of pride in our political system at the moment. We should be advocating in all terms, in all times, in all places, against terrorism, especially when it comes to the way that Britain operates philosophically. We do think that there should be an accountability of the top to the bottom, and that in general, the people at the bottom should have their interests served as well. The reason to resort to terrorism is when the only justified reason that you would be aiming to resort to terrorism is when that is not being honoured, but that was honoured. So this is not, even in the context she's presenting it, something justified. Again, it appears to just be this kind of heroic mythologization of her own past. But this is the mythologization of a murderer, someone who killed someone for the effect of failing to overthrow the British. And it wasn't a direct cause in the act anyway. But this person, Ash Sarkar, who praises terrorism, has a platform on every BBC news programme that she can get her hands on. She goes on ITV, she writes for the BBC occasionally, she writes for various other outlets like The Guardian, where this article was published, where it was featured, and still is featured, as a homage and an ode to a family terrorist on the Sarkar line. Interesting thing, isn't it?